My name is Adriana Sterling. 10 years ago, I was cast out of my family's estate like a common thief, accused of stealing the very heirlooms I had spent my life protecting. My sister, Isabella, the golden daughter with the porcelain smile, had gambled away our legacy in the secret corners of high-stakes underground clubs, and she needed a scapegoat. My parents chose to believe her lies because the truth was too expensive for their reputation. They threw me into a midnight storm with nothing but the clothes on my back and a heart that turned to ice before I even reached the gates. They thought they were rid of their black sheep. They didn't realize they were sending me into the forge. Now, I don't just hold the truth, I hold the scales of justice. And for the Sterlings, the weight of their sins is about to become unbearable. The night I was exiled didn't feel real until the iron gates of Sterling Manor slammed shut behind me. The sound was final, a heavy metallic clang that echoed through the valley, swallowed quickly by the relentless roar of a summer thunderstorm. Rain drenched my thin silk dress in seconds, pulling the warmth from my skin. I stood on the muddy shoulder of the road, looking back at the glowing windows of the dining room, where my family was likely already purging my name from their conversations. "I didn't do it, Dad!" I had screamed an hour earlier, my voice cracking as I stood in the center of the grand library. My father, Arthur Sterling, didn't even look at me. He was staring at the empty velvet-lined display case where the Romanov brooch had sat for 3 generations. "The security codes used were yours, Adriana. The pawnshop receipts were found in your nightstand. Isabella saw you leaving the vault. What more do I need? A confession? I've spent 40 years building the Sterling reputation, and I won't have it tarnished by a common thief." Isabella was huddled in the corner, a lace handkerchief pressed to her eyes. To anyone else, she looked devastated. To me, I saw the slight, trembling tension in her fingers, the telltale sign of her adrenaline high. She had planted the receipts. She had used my birthday as the code. She had sold the brooch to pay off the debt collectors who had started showing up at her boutique. "Please, Isabella," I whispered, stepping toward her. Tell them the truth." She looked up, her eyes wide and wet with artificial grief. "How could you, Adriana? We gave you everything. Why wasn't it enough?" That was the moment the world shifted. I realized that facts didn't matter in this house, only the narrative did, and Isabella was the master of the story. My mother, Evelyn, didn't even stand up. She just sipped her tea, her face a mask of cold disappointment. "Get out, Adriana. Take nothing that was bought with Sterling money. You are no longer a part of this bloodline." Now, standing in the rain, the weight of that rejection hit me. I had exactly $12 in my pocket and a dead cell phone. I started walking. Every step away from the manor felt like a layer of my old self was being stripped away. The kind sister, the quiet daughter, the loyal Sterling were all drowning in the mud. By the time I reached the bus station 3 miles away, I wasn't crying anymore. I was shivering, but my mind was terrifyingly clear. I looked at my reflection in the grimy window of the station. I looked like a ghost. "Where to, girlie?" the ticket agent asked, not looking up from his newspaper. "As far as $12 will take me," I said. I ended up in a gray industrial city 5 hours north. For the first month, I slept in a shelter that smelled of bleach and despair. I took a job scrubbing floors at a law firm, Blackwood and Finch. I chose it specifically. I wanted to be near the machinery of the law. I wanted to understand how evidence was built, how lies were dismantled, and how power was truly wielded. During the day, I cleaned the offices of men who didn't know I existed. At night, I sat in the firm's library, reading textbooks on criminal law and forensic accounting. I taught myself how to trace the very digital footprints that Isabella used to frame me. I learned that money always leaves a trail, even when it's laundered through high-end boutiques and gambling dens. "You're the girl who cleans the third floor, aren't you?" I looked up from a thick volume on racketeering to see Marcus Blackwood, the senior partner. He was a man with eyes like flint and a reputation for being the most ruthless prosecutor the state had ever seen before he went into private practice. "I am," I said, not closing the book. "Why are you reading about the RICO Act at 2 a.m.? "Because I want to know how to tear down a legacy built on fraud." Marcus leaned against the mahogany bookshelf, studying me. "Most people in your position want a paycheck. You want a weapon. I want the truth to have teeth," I said. Marcus didn't fire me. Instead, he made me his paralegal. He saw the fire in me, a cold, disciplined rage that he recognized. Under his tutelage, I worked twice as hard as any law student from Harvard. I spent years in the shadows, helping him build cases against the very kind of people my father called friends, the elite who thought they were above the reach of the law. 5 years in, I passed the bar exam with the highest score in the state's history. I didn't join a fancy firm. I joined the district attorney's office. I wanted to be on the side that wore the badge. I wanted the power to issue subpoenas, to freeze assets, and to look into the dark heart of financial empires. I changed my name. I was no longer Adriana Sterling. I was Adriana Thorne, a name I chose because it was sharp and meant to draw blood. I watched the Sterlings from afar. Through the news and social columns, I saw Isabella get married to a hedge fund manager. I saw my father receive Entrepreneur of the Year awards. But I also saw the subtle cracks, a lawsuit here, a failed merger there. I saw Isabella's boutique empire expanding far faster than its revenue could explain. "They're cooking the books, Marcus," I said one evening, showing my old mentor a series of public filings. "The Sterlings are using Isabella's boutiques to launder the family's offshore gains. They've been doing it for decades." "If you go after them, Adriana, you have to be perfect," Marcus warned me. "They have friends in high places." "I don't need friends," I said, looking at the rain against the window, the same kind of rain that had fallen the night they threw me out. By year 8, I was the youngest assistant district attorney to lead the Financial Crimes Division. I became a nightmare for the city's corrupt elite. I was known as the Ice Queen, unbribable, relentless, and completely invisible to the social circles I had once belonged to. Then the opportunity arrived. The federal government was looking for a new United States attorney for the district, the General Prosecutor, someone to lead a massive crackdown on white-collar crime and political corruption. I applied. I didn't use the Sterling name, but I used the Sterling secrets as my compass. I knew exactly where the bodies were buried in the city's financial district, because I had grown up listening to those men brag at my father's dinner table. I got the job. 10 years to the day after I was kicked out into the rain, I sat in my new office, the seal of the United States behind me. My first order of business was a stack of warrants. The names on the top of the pile were Arthur Sterling, Evelyn Sterling, and Isabella Sterling Vane. The investigation was silent and total. We didn't just look for a brooch, we looked for the millions they had hidden from the IRS and the investors they had defrauded to maintain their golden lifestyle. I received a call from their high-priced defense attorney, a man I knew from my days as a cleaning girl. He was frantic. "Madam Prosecutor, my clients are respected members of the community. This must be a misunderstanding. We would like to negotiate a meeting." "Bring them in," I said, my voice as cold as the iron gates of Sterling Manor. I stood by the window, watching the clouds gather. It was starting to rain.
The morning of the raid was calm, the kind of stillness that precedes a landslide. I sat in the back of a black government vehicle, 3 blocks away from Sterling Manor, watching the live feeds from the tactical units. My coffee was black and cold, much like the feeling in my chest. "All units, move in," I said into the radio. I watched the screen as federal agents swarmed the estate. The iron gates, the ones that had locked me out a decade ago, were now being held open by men in windbreakers with FBI stenciled in bold yellow letters. There was a poetic symmetry to it that almost made me smile, but I had long ago forgotten how to do that with sincerity. My father was the first to be let out. He was in his silk dressing gown, his face a mask of indignant fury. I could see him shouting, his finger jabbing the air, likely threatening to call the governor, the senator, or his golfing buddies at the Justice Department. He still believed his name was a shield. He didn't know that I had spent the last 18 months systematically turning that shield into a target. Then came Isabella. She was draped in a designer robe, her hair perfectly coiffed even at dawn, clutching a small dog and looking at the agents with a mixture of confusion and practiced innocence. She was still playing the golden daughter, the victim of a terrible misunderstanding. I watched her lips move. She was likely telling them she had no idea about the offshore accounts or the boutique alternative bookkeeping. "Is the mother secure?" I asked. "Evelyn Sterling is in the library, ma'am. She's refusing to leave her chair without her attorney." The agent's voice crackled back. "Let her sit. It's the last time she'll sit in that room." I directed the car to pull up to the front steps. I didn't get out immediately. I wanted to feel the gravel beneath the tires, the same gravel I had walked on with bare feet 10 years ago. I stepped out, the crisp morning air hitting my face. I wore my official suit, my badge pinned to my belt, and a folder containing the frozen asset orders in my hand. I walked past Isabella. She didn't recognize me. To her, I was just another faceless government official, a nuisance to be managed. She tried to step into my path. "Excuse me, officer," her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "There has clearly been a mistake. My husband is a very influential man in the city. If you leave now and apologize, I might be able to keep this out of the papers for you." I stopped and looked at her. Really looked at her. The porcelain skin was starting to show the stress of a decade of lies. The diamonds on her fingers were bought with the blood of the investors she had defrauded. "The papers are already printing the story, Isabella," I said. My voice was different, lower, colder, forged in courtrooms and late-night depositions. She froze. She tilted her head, a flicker of recognition dancing behind her eyes like a dying candle. Do I know you?" "You knew a girl named Adriana, but you killed her the night you stole that brooch. I'm just the one who came to collect the debt." I didn't wait for her to scream. I didn't wait for her to realize. I walked straight into the house. The interior of Sterling Manor was exactly as I remembered it, opulent, cold, and smelling of expensive lilies. I walked into the library. My mother was sitting in her favorite wingback chair, sipping tea that must have been freezing by now. She looked up, her eyes narrowing as I approached. "You're the one leading this circus. I suppose you're proud of yourself, harassing a family of our stature. My attorney will have your badge by noon." "Your attorney is currently being questioned in a separate room, Evelyn, and as for your stature, it's about 3 feet underground right now. We found the Romanov brooch." That got her. She fumbled her tea, the fine china clattering against the saucer. That's impossible. That was lost years ago. My daughter Adriana stole it. Actually, I said, leaning forward, we found it in a private vault in the Cayman Islands, a vault registered to Isabella Sterling. It wasn't pawned. She kept it as a trophy, along with records of the $4 million she siphoned from your charity foundation to pay her gambling debts in Macau. Evelyn's face went pale. The mask of the perfect mother finally began to crumble. Isabella? She wouldn't. She's the good daughter. She's the daughter you chose, I corrected, and now she's the daughter who is going to testify against you to save herself. That's the problem with families built on lies, Evelyn. There's no honor among thieves once the handcuffs come out. The agents began carrying out boxes of files. They were taking the ledgers, the laptops, and the hidden hard drives from behind the false wall in my father's study, a wall I had pointed out to the search team before we even arrived. My father was brought back into the room to sign the seizure forms. He was disheveled now, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. He looked at me, then at the nameplate on my folder. Adriana Thorne, United States Attorney. Thorne? He whispered. Adriana? Hello, Arthur. I see the house is still as drafty as ever, but don't worry. Where you're going, the walls are made of solid concrete, no drafts at all. He lunged toward me, but the agents held him back. You did this. You've been planning this. You little bitch. We gave you life. I gave you a wet dress and $12. I gave myself the law, and today the law is taking everything back. I walked out of the library as they began to read him his rights. I stood on the porch, watching the tow trucks take away the fleet of luxury cars. Isabella was sitting on the grass, sobbing, not out of regret, but out of fear. We have them, ma'am, my lead agent said, walking up beside me. The paper trail is solid. The money laundering, the tax evasion, the wire fraud, it's a slam dunk. It's not enough, I said, looking up at the gray sky. I don't just want them in jail, I want them to understand exactly what it feels like to have nothing, to be invisible, to be cast out. I got back into the car. As we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. For the first time in 10 years, the Sterling gates were wide open, but this time they weren't letting me out. They were letting the world in to see the rot inside. The first part of the harvest was done, but the real trial, the one where I would sit in the high chair and watch them beg, was just beginning.
The detention center was a far cry from the velvet-draped rooms of the manor. I sat behind the reinforced glass of the visitors' wing, watching through the monitor as Isabella was led into the room. She was wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that clashed violently with her porcelain skin. She had no makeup, no diamonds, and for the first time in her life, she looked ordinary. She picked up the phone, her hand trembling. I did the same. "Adriana," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I knew it was you. I felt it the moment you stepped onto the porch. You've changed, but those eyes, you still have that look you had the night The night you framed me?" I finished for her. "Let's not waste time on nostalgia, Isabella. Your attorneys have filed 17 motions to dismiss. All 17 were denied this morning. Your husband has already filed for divorce to protect his own assets. You are alone." "I did it for us," she suddenly hissed, leaning closer to the glass. "The family was failing, Adriana. Dad had made some terrible investments. I needed that money to keep the boutique open, to keep our name in the papers. If the Sterlings fell, we all fell. I thought you were strong. I thought you could handle it." "You thought I was disposable," I corrected. "You chose the one person you knew wouldn't fight back because I loved you. That was your mistake. You taught me that love is a structural weakness." Isabella's expression shifted. The victim mask slipped, revealing the sharp, desperate predator beneath. "What do you want? You have the badge. You have the house. You've frozen everything. Are you here to gloat, or are you here to make a deal? I don't make deals with thieves, Isabella. I make examples of them. You need me, she whispered, a desperate glint in her eyes. Dad didn't just launder money for the boutique, he's involved with some very dangerous people in the shipping industry, people who don't like federal prosecutors. I have the ledgers, Adriana, the real ones, the ones hidden in the cloud server you haven't found yet. I'll give you everything, Dad, Mom, the whole board of directors, if you get me a suspended sentence. I looked at her, feeling a strange mix of disgust and fascination. She was willing to sell our parents to the wolves just to avoid a prison cell. It was exactly what I expected, yet it still tasted like ash. The cloud server located at Silver Lining 88? I asked calmly. Isabella froze. Her jaw dropped slightly. We found the encryption keys in your vanity mirror, hidden behind the glass. My team spent the night downloading the entire history of the Sterling shipping manifests. I don't need your testimony to bury Arthur. I already have him, and I have you. I stood up, adjusting my blazer. Wait, she screamed, banging her fist against the glass. Adriana, please, we're sisters, we're blood. You can't let them take me to a state facility. I won't survive there. You'll survive, Isabella. You'll learn how to scrub floors. You'll learn how to sleep when it's loud. And every night when it rains against those small, barred windows, you'll remember the night you stood on the porch and watched me walk into the dark. Consider it a long overdue education. I hung up the phone and walked out, ignoring her muffled screams. The next day, I was in my office when my father's lead attorney, a man named Henderson who had once bought me a doll for my 7th birthday, walked in. He looked like a man who had seen the end of the world. "Madam Prosecutor," he said, sitting down heavily, "Arthur is willing to sign a full confession for the tax evasion and the fraud. He only asks for one thing. He wants the charges against Evelyn dropped. She's not well, Adriana. This stress is killing her. She was well enough to watch me get thrown out like trash. She was well enough to keep the Romanoff brooch on her dresser while I was sleeping in a shelter. No, Henderson, the law doesn't care about wellness. It cares about complicity." "You're being vindictive," he said, his voice trembling with indignation. "I'm being thorough. Vindictiveness is personal. This is professional. I am the United States Attorney, and I am cleaning a house that has been infested with rot for 30 years. If Evelyn didn't want to be part of the crime, she shouldn't have enjoyed the profits." As Henderson left, I pulled a small, battered photo from my drawer. It was the only thing I had managed to keep, a photo of me and Isabella when we were children building sandcastles on the beach. I looked at it for a long moment, then I walked over to the paper shredder. The machine hummed as it consumed the last remnant of my childhood. Part 3. The Severing. The legal battle was just heating up. The Sterlings were calling in every favor, trying to pressure the Department of Justice to move the case to a more lenient district. They didn't realize that I had already shared the evidence with the press. The public was hungry for the heads of the elite. I was no longer just the prosecutor. I was the face of a movement. And as the rain began to patter against my office window, I realized that for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't cold. I was the fire.
The air in the federal courtroom was thick with the scent of old paper and suppressed panic. I stood at the prosecution table, my hands resting lightly on the wood. I didn't need notes. I had memorized their crimes the way a prisoner memorizes the cracks in a cell wall. The defense claims that the Sterling shipping empire was a victim of complex market fluctuations and rogue employees, I said, my voice echoing in the hallowed space. They claim that the millions missing from the pension funds were simply administrative errors. But the truth is much simpler. The Sterlings didn't just steal from their investors, they stole from the future.
Arthur Sterling sat at the defense table, his face a mask of stoic arrogance. He whispered something to Henderson, who shook his head. They were looking for a loophole, a technicality, a way to make me look like a daughter with a grudge rather than a prosecutor with a case. The prosecution calls its next witness. I call Elias Thorne. The room went deathly silent. My mother, Evelyn, gasped, her hand flying to her throat. My father actually stood up before his lawyer pulled him back down. The name Thorne wasn't just my chosen alias, it was the name of the man who had been my father's first business partner, the man who had mysteriously vanished from the corporate records 30 years ago. An elderly man entered the room, leaning heavily on a cane. His eyes were bright with a fierce subterranean intelligence. He was the real Elias Thorne, the man my father had framed for embezzlement in the 90s to seize total control of the company. "Mr. Thorne," I said, walking toward the witness stand, "can you tell the court about your relationship with Arthur Sterling? He were brothers in all but blood, until Arthur realized that blood was cheaper than profit. He did to me exactly what he did to his own daughter 10 years ago. He found a weakness, he planted evidence, and he used his influence to cast me into the wilderness so he could take my share of the company. And what did you do, Mr. Thorne?" "I waited," he said, looking directly at my father. "I lived in a small apartment above a tailor shop. I watched him build a mansion on my back. And then, 10 years ago, a young woman found me. She was soaked to the bone, shivering, and she had a look in her eyes that I recognized. It was the look of someone who had been sacrificed at the altar of Sterling pride. I felt the eyes of the jury on me. I didn't flinch. That young woman was Adriana," Elias continued. "She didn't ask for money. She asked for the ledgers I had kept hidden for 30 decades, the original ledgers from the founding of the firm, the ones that prove the seed money for the Sterling Empire didn't come from a family inheritance, but an illegal arms shipment in 1994. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel, but the damage was done. My father's face was no longer stoic. It was the color of curdled milk. "Objection!" Henderson screamed. "This is hearsay. This is ancient history." "It is a pattern of practice, Your Honor," I countered, my voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "The defendant has spent 30 years perfecting the art of the fall guy. He framed Mr. Thorne to start his empire, and he framed his daughter to protect it. It is the very definition of a criminal enterprise." The judge overruled the objection. I turned back to the witness. "Mr. Thorne, did you help Adriana Sterling build the forensic case against the offshore accounts?" "I did," he said with a grim smile. "We traced the money from the 1994 shipment through 6 different shell companies, all the way to the account Isabella used to buy that Romanov brooch. It's all the same money, Your Honor. It's all blood money." As Elias was led from the stand, I walked back to my table. I felt Isabella's gaze burning into the side of my head. She was no longer crying. She was terrified. She finally understood that this wasn't just a legal case. It was an exhumation. I was digging up every lie they had ever told, every person they had ever stepped on, and I was piling them up until they formed a wall they couldn't climb over. During the lunch recess, I found my mother waiting for me in the hallway. She had evaded the press and was standing near the elevators, looking frail and diminished. "Adriana," she whispered, her voice a ghost of her former authority. "Please, you've made your point. You've humiliated us. Isn't this enough? Your father's heart can't take much more of this." "He didn't care about my heart when he sent me out in a storm with $12, Evelyn," I said, not stopping. "He didn't care about the lives he ruined to build that house. Why should I care about his stature now?" "We're your family," she cried out. I stopped and turned to look at her. "No, you're my defendants, and the state doesn't negotiate with people who use their children as shields." I walked back into the courtroom.
The afternoon session was even brutal. We presented the digital evidence, the emails Isabella sent to her bookie, the wire transfers my father had authorized to bribe the port authorities, and the surveillance footage of my mother wearing the stolen brooch at a private party in London 2 years after I was exiled. By the time the sun began to set, the Sterlings looked like they were sinking in a sinking ship. The Golden family was tarnished beyond repair. Part 4. The Exhumation, I wrote in my private log that night. The trial was far from over, but the myth of the Sterlings was dead. As the rain began to fall again, it always seemed to rain when the truth was coming out. I realized that I wasn't just the prosecutor. I was the architect of their ruin, and tomorrow I would show them the basement of the house they had built.
The cream-colored stationery sitting on my kitchen island felt like a relic from a past life I had spent a decade trying to cremate. It was my father's signature heavy paper, the kind he used for corporate takeovers and disinheriting daughters. There was no stamp. It had been hand-delivered, which meant my impenetrable security had been compromised. I know about the girl in the gray coat. I know what happened in the warehouse in year 3. Drop the RICO charges or the world finds out that the General Prosecutor is a murderer. Choose wisely, Adriana. Family is forever. I didn't tremble. Instead, I felt a chilling sort of clarity. Year 3 was the winter I had lived in a basement apartment, working 16 hours a day as a paralegal while conducting unauthorized surveillance on the Sterling shipping docks. I had been cornered by a hired enforcer named Silas, a man sent to ensure no nosy girls looked too closely at the manifest logs. In that dark, damp warehouse, it had been a matter of survival. I had defended myself with a heavy iron pipe, and when the dust settled, Silas wasn't breathing. Marcus, who had already seen my potential, helped me bury the incident deep enough that even the FBI couldn't find it. Or so I thought. My father hadn't just been laundering money, he had been collecting ghosts. The next morning, I bypassed the courtroom and headed straight to the federal holding facility. I didn't take a stenographer. I didn't take a guard. I wanted to see the man who still thought he could negotiate with the law. Arthur Sterling was sitting in the interview room, looking remarkably restored. He had traded his orange jumpsuit for a clean white shirt, and the way he leaned back in his chair suggested he believed he had already won. "Did you find my note, Adriana?" he asked, his voice dripping with that old patronizing warmth. I thought it was time we had a private chat, away from the cameras and the prying eyes of your justice. "I found your confession of extortion and witness tampering, Arthur," I said, sliding a digital recorder onto the table. "You really should be more careful with the mercenaries you hire. The man who delivered that note is currently in a holding cell 2 floors down. He was remarkably eager to trade your name for a lighter sentence." His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but his eyes remained hard. "You don't have Silas. The evidence of your little accident in year 3 is held by a third party. If I don't call them by noon today, a video file and a sworn statement from a hidden witness will be sent to every news outlet in the country. A general prosecutor with blood on her hands? You'd be out of office by sunset and in a cell by midnight." "There is no video, Arthur," I said, leaning forward until our faces were inches apart. "The cameras in that sector of the docks were disabled 48 hours before the incident, by your own orders, to cover a shipment of illegal luxury cars. And your hidden witness? Silas didn't die that night. He spent 6 months in a private clinic you paid for, and then you had him shipped to a prison in South America under a false name to keep him silent." I watched the color drain from his face. He hadn't expected me to have tracked Silas down. I found him 6 months ago, Arthur. I didn't find him as a prosecutor. I found him as a woman looking for her own ghost. Silas is now in federal protection. He isn't going to testify against me. He's going to testify against you for the attempted murder of a federal officer. Me, because the moment I stepped onto those docks 10 years ago, I was already working as a confidential informant for the DA's office. Everything you did to stop me is now a separate, non-negotiable charge. Arthur's hands began to shake. The king was finally realizing that his throne was a pile of dry tinder, and I was holding the match. "You're a monster," he whispered. "You'd destroy your own father just to prove a point?" "I'm not proving a point, Arthur. I'm completing a sentence. You cast me out into the rain because you thought I was the weak link in your chain. You didn't realize that the rain only makes the iron stronger. You tried to blackmail me with the very trauma you caused. That's not family, Arthur. That's a pathology." I stood up, the chair screeching against the concrete floor. The RICO charges stand. In fact, I'm adding 3 counts of capital solicitation. Your attorney will receive the new discovery files within the hour. And as for the Sterling name, by the time I'm done, it won't even be fit for a headstone. I walked out of the room, leaving him in the cold, gray silence of his own making. As I stepped back into the sunlight, I realized the ghost of year 3 was finally dawn. It wasn't a burden anymore. It was the final piece of the cage I was building for the man who tried to kill my soul. The war was no longer just about a brooch or a few $1,000,000. It was about the total annihilation of a legacy built on the bones of the innocent. And as I looked at the courthouse in the distance, I knew that the harvest was almost ready.
The morning after my confrontation with Arthur, the air in the city felt heavy, charged with the static of an impending storm. My father's attempt at blackmail had failed, but it had triggered a much larger and more lethal mechanism. By exposing his ties to the Neptune shipping network, I hadn't just attacked a corrupt businessman. I had declared war on an international cartel that used the Sterling fleet as its invisible bridge across the Atlantic. I was sitting in my office at 7 a.m. when the first report came in. A key witness, a former dock manager who had agreed to testify about the Project Neptune manifests, had been found dead in his apartment. It was a professional hit, clean, quiet, and designed to send a message. "They're cleaning house, Adriana," Marcus said, pacing my office. His hand was gripping a burner phone so tightly his knuckles were white. "The cartel doesn't care about the RICO trial anymore. They're in damage control mode. Anyone who can connect the Sterling name to the Trident organization is a target, and you're at the top of that list." "I'm not stopping, Marcus," I said, my eyes fixed on the map of the Sterling shipping routes pinned to my wall. "If they're killing witnesses, it means the Neptune files I have are even more damaging than I thought. There's a ghost shipment mentioned in the 2024 logs, something labeled medical supplies but routed through a defunct port in the Balkans. That's their heart, Marcus. That's where the money turns into lead." As I spoke, the high-velocity glass of my office window, reinforced specifically for my protection, shuddered under a massive impact. A single spider-webbed crack bloomed in the center. A sniper. "Down!" Marcus screamed, tackling me to the floor just as a second round whistled through the air, punching a hole through the leather of my executive chair. The office exploded into chaos. Federal marshals burst through the door, weapons drawn, while sirens began to wail across the government plaza. I lay on the cold carpet, the smell of cordite and ozone filling my lungs. I wasn't afraid. I was furious. They had tried to kill me 10 years ago with silence and poverty. Now they were trying to do it with steel.
"We have to move you, ma'am," the lead marshal barked, hauling me to my feet. "The safe house is compromised. We have reports of chatter on the encrypted bands. They have teams in the city." "Where?" I asked, grabbing the Neptune file from my desk. "There's a secondary site, an old federal annex near the coast," he replied, ushering me toward the private elevator. As we moved through the garage in an armored convoy, my phone buzzed. It was an intercepted recording from the detention center. I pressed the phone to my ear. It was Isabella. "I can give her to you," my sister's voice whispered, sounding frantic and hollow. "I know where she goes when she's cornered. I know the old summer cottage in the hills, the one that isn't on any of the public records. Just get me out of here before the sentencing, please. I'll give you the coordinates." The sting of her betrayal was different this time. It wasn't the sharp pain of a sister's lie. It was the dull ache of a predictable disappointment. Isabella was still the same girl who had framed me for a brooch. She was still trying to buy her comfort with my blood. "She's selling me to the cartel, Marcus," I said, staring out the darkened window of the SUV. "We need to use it," Marcus said, his eyes cold. "If she gave them the cottage coordinates, we set a trap. We let them think you're there while we finalize the Neptune indictments at the coast." "No," I said. "If we do that, they'll know we're onto them. We need them to think Isabella succeeded. I'm going to the cottage, but I'm going with a tactical strike team. I want the men who are coming for me. I want the faces behind the Neptune masks." The drive to the hills was a blur of gray rain and winding roads. The cottage was a small stone structure my grandfather had built, a place where I had once felt safe before the sterling rot had spread. Now it was a bait shop. We arrived at midnight. The marshals took their positions in the tree line, invisible in their tactical gear. I sat in the darkened living room, the Neptune file on the table in front of me. I waited in the silence, listening to the rain hammer against the roof, the same sound that had accompanied my exile 10 years ago. At 2 a.m., the perimeter sensors flickered. 3 shadows moved across the lawn, ghosting through the mist with the practiced ease of professional killers. They didn't use the door, they used the windows, shattering the glass with silenced rounds. I didn't move as they entered the room, their laser sights dancing across my chest. "The file," the leader rasped, his voice a low growl. "You're half right," I said, clicking on a high-intensity lamp. The light blinded them for a split second, and in that moment, the marshals opened fire from the rafters and the kitchen. It was over in less than 30 seconds. 2 of the assassins were down, the third was pinned to the floor, with my lead marshal's boot on his neck. I walked over to the survivor. I knelt down, looking into his cold, dark eyes. "You work for the Trident. You work for the men my father served." "You're already dead, Torn," he spat, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "You think you can stop a tide with a badge?" "I'm not stopping the tide. I'm rerouting it. Your medical supplies shipment in the Balkans? I just sent the coordinates to the International Task Force. By sunrise, your entire Mediterranean network will be in handcuffs. And you're going to tell me exactly which politician gave my father the clearance codes." I stood up, the rain still pouring outside. For the first time, I felt the weight of the Sterling name fully dissolved. I wasn't the girl in the gray coat anymore. I was the person who had finally broken the chain. "Take them away," I ordered, "and get me a secure line to the courthouse. I want to add conspiracy to commit murder to my sister's charges." As the sun began to peek through the clouds, I looked at the old cottage. It was a ruin now, but it had served its purpose. The Sterling legacy was no longer just a financial scandal. It was a pile of ashes, and the fire was just getting started.
The tactical victory at the cottage had changed the atmosphere of the trial from a financial inquiry to a high-stakes national security crisis. When I walked into the courtroom the following morning, the usual buzz of the gallery was replaced by a chilling, heavy silence. Even the media seemed to hold their breath. I had spent the night in a secure bunker, and the lack of sleep had carved my features into a mask of granite. I stepped to the podium, not looking at my father, whose face was now a map of pure, unadulterated terror. He knew. He knew that if I had survived the night, it meant the men he feared most had failed. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady enough to cut glass, "the prosecution moves to introduce supplemental evidence obtained during the arrest of 3 individuals at a private residence last night. This evidence is no longer limited to the Sterling family's tax records. It pertains to a list of beneficiaries of the Neptune shipping network." A man in the 3rd row, a high-ranking senator I had seen at my father's Christmas parties when I was a child, suddenly stood up and walked out. I didn't need to name him. Not yet. "The Neptune files," I continued, "contain a ledger known as the Golden Circle. It is a record of bribes paid to 32 public officials over 2 decades to ensure the Sterling fleet was never inspected, never audited, and never questioned. My father wasn't just a businessman, he was the paymaster for a shadow government." I turned to look at Arthur. "And my sister, Isabella, was his courier. She used her charity missions and fashion tours to hand-deliver the encryption keys for the offshore accounts that funded these officials' campaigns." Isabella, sitting behind her lawyer, let out a soft, broken sob. She looked at me, her eyes begging for a mercy I didn't possess. She had tried to sell my life to the Trident, and now she was realizing that the currency she used had no value in this room. "The prosecution calls Arthur Sterling to the stand." The courtroom erupted. A defendant being called by the prosecution was a rare, aggressive move, but I had the leverage now. As Arthur walked to the stand, he looked like a man walking toward a firing squad. He was no longer the king of the city. He was a broken old man who had realized his daughter had outgrown his shadow. "Arthur," I said, standing directly in front of him, "who is the Trident's voice in Washington? Who gave you the clearance for the Balkan shipment?" He stayed silent, his eyes darting to the back of the room where 2 men in suits were watching him intently. "If you don't answer," I whispered, leaning in close so only he could hear, "I will ensure that Isabella is processed into the general population of the harshest federal facility in the country. She won't last a week. But if you give me the names, I will put her in a witness protection wing. This is your last chance to be a father, Arthur. Choose her life or choose the men who just tried to kill me." I saw the moment his spirit finally snapped. He looked at Isabella, then back at me. Tears filled his eyes, real tears of a man who had lost everything. "It was Senator Vance," he rasped into the microphone, "and Secretary Miller. They took 40% of the Neptune profits. They promised to protect us. They promised the girl would be handled 10 years ago." The courtroom went into a frenzy. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, but the Golden Circle had been shattered. I had just named the untouchables. During the afternoon recess, I found my mother, Evelyn, waiting in the witness room. She wasn't angry anymore. She looked hollowed out, her designer suit hanging loosely on her frame. "Adriana," she said, her voice a mere thread of sound, "they're going to take the house. They're going to take everything, aren't they? The house was bought with the blood of the people your husband defrauded, Evelyn. It was never yours to begin with. You lived in a museum of theft." "Where will I go?" she asked, looking at me as if I were a stranger. "To the same place you sent me, into the world. Only you won't be 20, you'll be 70, and you'll learn what it means to be invisible.
Perhaps then you'll understand why I never stopped walking. I left her there, staring at her own reflection in the darkened window. As I walked back to my office to prepare for the final closing arguments, Marcus met me in the hall. "The senator has been detained at the airport. Miller is in custody. You did it, Marcus. You didn't just win a trial, you took down a regime." "The job isn't finished until the sentence is read, Marcus," I said, looking at the rain that had begun to fall again. I stood by the window of the courthouse, watching the police cars surround the building. 10 years ago, the rain was my enemy. Today, it was my witness. The Sterling name was being washed away, and in its place, a new kind of justice was being forged. "Part 7, The Fall of the Gods," I whispered. Tomorrow the jury would deliberate, but in my heart, the verdict had been written a decade ago.
The day of the verdict felt like the final chord of a long, dissonant symphony. The air in the courtroom was stagnant, heavy with the collective breath of the press, the public, and the fallen elite. I stood at my desk, my spine a rigid line of silver and grit. I didn't look at the defense table. I didn't need to. I could hear the ghost of my father's labored breathing and the soft, rhythmic clicking of Isabella's nervous fingernails against the wood. "The jury has reached a verdict," the bailiff announced. I watched the 12 men and women file in. They didn't look at the Sterlings. They looked at me. Or rather, they looked through me, at the mountain of evidence I had meticulously built over 10 years. "On the count of racketeering and corrupt organizations," the foreperson began, her voice steady, "we find the defendants Arthur, Evelyn, and Isabella Sterling guilty." One by one, the counts were read: money laundering, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, witness tampering. Each guilty was a hammer blow, a rhythmic shattering of the Sterling legacy. Isabella collapsed into her chair, her face buried in her hands, her golden girl persona finally dissolving into a puddle of ordinary, terrified tears. My mother stared blankly at the seal on the wall, her mind perhaps already wandering through the empty halls of a mansion she would never see again. My father, however, looked at me. For the first time, there was no anger in his eyes, only a hollow, echoing recognition. He saw that he hadn't just lost his company, he had lost the war for my soul. He had tried to turn me into a victim, but he accidentally built an executioner. "The defendants will be remanded into custody immediately," the judge declared, the gavel striking the bench with a sound like a closing tomb. "Sentencing will follow in 30 days. This court is adjourned." As the marshals moved in to lead them away, the room erupted into a frenzy of camera flashes and shouted questions. I gathered my files with calm, deliberate motions. I didn't rush. I didn't gloat. I felt a strange, profound lightness, the kind of silence that follows a decade-long storm. In the chaos, I found myself standing just inches away from Isabella as they led her toward the side exit. "Adriana," she choked out, her voice barely audible over the roar of the crowd. "What now? What happens to us now?" "Now," I said, looking at her with a clarity that was almost surgical, "you live the life you earned. You'll wake up to a bell, you'll eat on a schedule, and you'll find that without the Sterling name, you are exactly what you feared most, a number in a ledger." "You hate us that much?" she whispered. "I don't hate you at all, Isabella. Hate is a form of attachment. I've spent 10 years detaching myself from you. Today, the process is complete." I walked out of the courtroom, through the sea of reporters, and out onto the front steps of the building. It wasn't raining. For the first time in my memory of the Sterlings, the sun was blindingly bright, reflecting off the glass towers of the city I had finally purged. Marcus was waiting for me at the bottom of the steps. He didn't say a word. He just handed me a small, plain envelope. Inside was a single key to a small, quiet house by the sea, far away from the shipping docks and the Golden Circle. The network, Monsieur, is being dismantled as we speak. The senator resigned an hour ago. The arrests are nationwide. You've changed the map, Adriana. I didn't want to change the map, Marcus, I said, looking up at the sky. I just wanted to find my way home. I drove out of the city that evening. I didn't take the armored SUV. I took a simple sedan, my own name, Adriana Thorne, on the registration. I drove past the gates of Sterling Manor one last time. The FBI tape was still fluttering in the wind, and a forfeited asset sign had been pounded into the manicured lawn. The gardens I had once tended were starting to grow wild. I didn't stop. I kept driving until the smell of salt air replaced the scent of cordite and old paper. I arrived at the small house on the cliff just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. I walked out onto the deck and looked at the ocean. The waves were rhythmic, indifferent to the rise and fall of empires or the petty cruelties of families. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was a silver coin, the very first dollar I'd earned scrubbing floors at Blackwood and Finch 10 years ago. I had kept it as a reminder of the weight of the climb. I looked at it for a long moment, then I tossed it into the sea. The girl who was cast out in the rain was finally gone. The General Prosecutor was a memory of a battle won. Here, on the edge of the world, I was just a woman with a clean slate and a quiet heart. Part 8. The Final Silence, I whispered to the wind. The storm had passed. The debt was paid in full, and for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't waiting for the rain. I was just watching the tide come in.